everyone. Very pleased to have so many of you with us for today's episode of This is CDR, an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals under development for New York and other states and jurisdictions. Everyone, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're coming from or zooming in from. I'll start. I'm Sue Dorward, a Sustainability and Energy Coordinator at Raritan Valley Community College in New Jersey. And I've been working with OpenAir on New Jersey's LECCLA bill for low carbon concrete procurement, which we hope will become law later this month. I'm excited to be sitting in for Toby Bryce today as moderator. Since low carbon concrete and direct air capture are two of my favorite subjects. And in honor of this, the topic, I am actually wearing an OpenAir t-shirt today. I don't know if you can see, that's Klaus Lochner. So he's one of the founding fathers of direct air capture. So in honor of the topic today, you can find the t-shirts for sale, I believe, on the OpenAir website. Shameless plug there. A quick background on OpenAir. Nope, it's not. There we go. We are a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of CDR solutions essential to solving the climate crisis. Our growing global community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of policy advocacy and CDR research and development. We'll put links to our website and Twitter in the chat, so please follow and join us there. Most of you are familiar with carbon dioxide removal, the practice of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it safely for a long period of time in the geosphere, the ocean, or long-lived products. When considering CDR as we are today and with this series, it's essential first and foremost to emphasize that CDR is not in any way an alternative to reducing emissions. We must reduce global emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible. That said, every credible climate forecast, including the most recent IPCC assessment report, shows that CDR will be required at the gigaton scale, that's billions of tons per year, by mid-century to counteract those emissions that are difficult or inequitable to abate, and ultimately to start removing the tremendous excess of anthropogenic CO2 already in the atmosphere so we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. If you're new to CDR, our previous This is CDR sessions are a perfect place to start. In the chat, we'll put a link to these recordings on OpenAir's YouTube channel, and a link to the CDR primer, which is a great and comprehensive resource if you really want to dig in. And of course, we're here today to learn more, and we'll be continuing these sessions weekly on an ongoing basis. Oh. All right. And now I will hand over to my colleague Megha, who will introduce the speakers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megha. I am an OpenAir member, usually based in London, but currently in California, where I'm from, and I work on policy advocacy opportunities also for California, including CRLA. A couple of housekeeping notes. So as usual, our format is going to be a 15 to 20-minute presentation, followed by a few prepared questions, and then we'll have moderated audience Q&A. So please type any questions you have into the Zoom Q&A box, and make sure that you find the Q&A one, not the chat. The event is being recorded, and we'll send the video link out to everyone who registered. We'll also post it to OpenAir's website and to our YouTube channel. We will also be live tweeting today's event, so we'll put the Twitter link in the chat, and please follow along with that. If you tweet, that event hashtag is #ThisIsCDR. And now for the main event. So this week on This is CDR, we're very happy to welcome OpenAir's own Naeem Merchant and Chris Neidl to survey the primary pathways by which concrete can sequester CO2 and how direct air carbon capture plus concrete represents a scalable CDR solution that we can start deploying today. Naeem Merchant is a carbon removal consultant helping NGOs and startups figure out how to equitably and rapidly scale up carbon removal technologies. Naeem entered the carbon removal space after spending a decade in the international development, working with governments to improve access to life-saving healthcare technologies. He has co-authored reports and white papers with organizations like Carbon 180 and the Clean Air Task Force, and has advised companies like Carbon Cure and Joro on supporting carbon removal. He's currently looking to leverage his market-shaping experience, policy background, and carbon removal expertise to accelerate the deployment of direct air capture and other permanent carbon removal technologies. Naeem also writes a regular newsletter called The Carbon Curve, which can be found at carboncurve.substack.com. Chris Neidl is the founder of OpenAir, or co-founder of OpenAir, and in this role works primarily on the collective's different advocacy missions. Chris entered the CDR space following a 15-year global career in the renewable energy field as a solar installer, educator, policy advocate, researcher, and business development manager. Since 2018, he's worked extensively on policies related to concrete decarbonization at the state and municipal level. In this capacity, he has led OpenAir's inaugural advocacy mission in support of the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, or LECCLA, in New York State, and currently serves as an industrial decarbonization policy consultant for the National Resources Defense Council. His concrete and climate-related writing has been featured in the peer-reviewed journal Frontiers in Climate, and he's co-authored Paving the Way for Low Carbon Concrete, a federal policy position paper produced by Carbon 180, as well as the forthcoming design guide to low carbon concrete procurement for state and local governments, published by the NRDC with Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, along with Caleb Woodhull. So Chris and Naeem, thanks so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
It's a pleasure. And I should say, Sue, I also have my Klaus Lochner t-shirt on. So it's one of our members, Ange Tran, designed it. I posted the link, highly recommend it, quality clothing. Really, a pleasure to be in the role as presenter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the presentation today, and then Naeem is going to jump on for the discussion. Probably about a 20-25-minute presentation. We'll cover a lot of ground, but really excited to get going. So as Megha and Sue just laid out, we're going to talk about the intersection of direct air capture and concrete. Presentation today is actually sort of a summation plus a little bit more content that's related to a blog post that Naeem, myself, and our partner Lucia Simonelli posted on the OpenAir blog a couple of weeks ago. And we have a question mark at the end because we really want to use this presentation to sort of provoke attention and focus on what we think is a really exciting opportunity for both DAC and carbon mineralized concrete. And so we look forward to, certainly during the discussion, to get some additional input on this idea from all of you. So again, as I said, this is really kind of comes from not only the blog post that myself, Naeem, and Lucia posted, but we've been writing together and thinking together about DAC and niches for DAC for several months. So in this presentation, some of the kind of core ideas we've been working with over several months are going to be featured. And as Sue just summarized, OpenAir has been neck deep in concrete from its very beginnings. Our initial advocacy missions were LECCLA. Sue has been championing an effort to get that bill passed in New Jersey, and we're really close. We just got a version of it signed by the governor the other day in New York. And we've also had other concrete related activities come out of the community for local governments as well. And as Megha just mentioned, Naeem and I co-authored along with Shuchi Talati, who's currently the Chief of Staff for the Department of Energy's Office of Carbon Management. But when we were all together at Carbon 180, we wrote a guide to procurement for the federal government called Paving the Way. So we've been dealing with this subject for quite a while. And as a total DAC geek myself, my whole interest in concrete from the very beginning had to do with potential opportunities it might create for direct air capture and that direct air capture might create for it. So what we're going to talk about today is really where those two things really directly interconnect, or where we think that they could. And this has obviously been a really momentous year for direct air capture. The year it went mainstream, according to Forbes, and I think we ended off the year nicely with the installation of the Orca project in Iceland, a Climeworks and CarbFix collaborative project, which really is the first commercially operational DAC carbon removal application. So we're at the beginnings of something really, really gigantic. And right now is the time that we have to scale things up by any means necessary. And so what we want to talk about today, before we even get into the concrete DAC connection, we have to give you a little bit of background on our thinking about niches for DAC and why they're important. And hand in hand with that is a particular view of DAC that's of interest to us of distributed and modular forms of DAC. And so we'll give you a little bit of a grounding in our thinking there, which will make sense of our key arguments for how DAC and concrete can intersect. And then at the end, we'll talk about just a couple of ideas about how we think we can really sort of spark this marriage of these two sectors. So just to start off with, to give a bit of a background about why niches are important right now at this stage and what they, what they sort of add to the DAC project writ large at this point. The key thing that we need to do with direct air capture technology right now is to drive the cost of it down. Right now, estimates range, but let's say $600 a ton of carbon removal. We need to bring that way down. The number that's often cited as sort of a magic number where we feel like it could really proliferate at a very large gigaton scale is at that $100 a ton mark. So we need to make that happen. And there's a few different levers that really will drive that. One is technical innovation, making the technology more efficient and high performance. That can have obviously direct cost implications. But the other two parts are achieving some scale up or economies of scale, raising up the volume of it so that it can bring down the price. That's both economies of scale in terms of large plant deployments, the actual size of the deployment, but also the actual mass production of DAC itself. Those are the two sides of the coin of a scale up. And then the other part, which you hear a lot about now, which is incredibly significant, is what we call learning by doing or experience curves. This is the phenomenon first observed by Theodore Wright. It's called Wright's law, where with every doubling of production of a technology or a product, you typically see a cost reduction. And that has to do with just producers getting better at producing a particular technology, figuring things out and making it more efficient. So these two things, scaling up and learning by doing, which are hand in hand, are key things that we want to be triggering right now to bring down the cost of DAC. And a really key thing that folks need to wrap their heads around, I think, all of us, is that we want to get to a multi-gigaton capacity for direct air capture, billions of tons by the middle of this century, and then double that by the end of the century. That's what the science tells us we have to do. For this defining decade, as it was recently called by Third Derivative in a great paper, which Megha will post in the chat, we have to really, this is the takeoff decade. And the main thing we need to do right now is we need to prioritize deploying direct air capture to bring down the cost, improve things out as quickly as possible. That's more important over the next decade as how much carbon dioxide is actually removed and permanently stored using DAC. And when we talk about prioritizing deployment, we need to do this very, very fast. We need to prioritize things that are going to actually move very, very quickly. And so that's what really puts the onus on these early markets. Where are we going to initially find opportunities to deploy direct air capture so that we can scale up and learn by doing? And obviously, the main long-term goal is to remove carbon dioxide and permanently put it somewhere, geologically, in the ocean, in materials. So the very first project, as we just showed, that's commercially operational, the Orca project, is purpose-built to do that in Iceland. And we want to see hopefully more and more of those every year for the remainder of the decade, scaling up and bringing the cost of DAC down. But we need to also pursue any other opportunity to deploy DAC. Another prime market that you hear a lot about is the intersection of direct air capture with fuel. And that actually takes many different forms, from things on one end, like using direct air capture for enhanced oil recovery to actually push more oil out of the ground. That is obviously controversial and not a use case that OpenAir plays any role in supporting. Other ways are negating emissions from fossil fuels by taking carbon out of the air and putting it in the ground, and then also producing non-fossil fuels with sort of synthetic hydrocarbons by taking carbon from the air, combining it with hydrogen that you can get from renewables by splitting water, and making that into a fuel. So these are what we typically right now most often think of the sort of prime markets that we're trying to exploit right now and going forward in order to scale up DAC and bring down the price. But the other key thing that we are going to talk about right now is there's many other opportunities for DAC deployment, which we need to be looking at right now and pursuing and exploring and realizing. And what DAC niche markets, as we call them, what defines a niche for us, our operating definition, is something where it's a sector where DAC would add value today. It solves problems or adds values for that sector. It's ready to go. It's only really depending on the readiness of DAC. But if DAC was ready to go right now, then you'd have a customer in this niche potentially. That these are also types of applications that can be deployed quickly. They don't take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to plan and deploy, but you can actually get it into the world relatively quickly. And then you can also do it with relatively little or sometimes no policy intervention or support. So that's our operating definition of a niche. Now, the relationship between niches and prime markets is that those niches we think can enable those prime markets. They'll make penetration in the removal and fuel spaces much more conducive. And so the reason why they do that is when you have a technology that's now interfacing with multiple sectors and use cases, just that encounter actually can trigger innovation. It can actually make the technology adapt to meet different needs and improve the technology. And then obviously the utilization of the deployment, that's what's going to be giving some initial scale. And then that scale up driving down the price and then potentially unlocking other niches and markets. And of course, the fact that these are markets that are going to be paying DAC providers is really, really important. It's a revenue stream. One article that I want to refer to, which was really influential on us and has been widely read, that was written by Habib Azarabadi and Klaus Lochner, well-known figures to say the least in the direct air capture world, that they published last spring. Dr. Azarabadi was actually, I think, the third guest of This Is CDR, so we can drop that video as well. But they did an assessment of how much scaling up of DAC has to happen in order to get it down to 100, both through scale and through learning, $100 per ton. And they actually very optimistic, or I think it was encouraging. What they estimated was about 1,000-fold increase would do that, and that to get to that scale, you're looking at what they modeled was 300 relatively small plants of about 1,000 tons removal per year would do the trick. So that seems like a big number, but compared to some of the other technologies like solar, that's actually a relatively small leap to make. So the other thing that niches do, which is really important, is they provide this emerging nascent sector with some resilience. If you're able to diversify your customer base across multiple different sectors, that helps you weather when the business cycle and the economy changes, and when an opportunity shuts down in one area. If you're more diversified, you're more likely to survive, basically. So this is what we think about as the value of niches for a technology like DAC. I come from solar, as Megha mentioned. I spent 15 years there, a very pivotal 15 years, where we saw this transform from a very fringe technology to now the cheapest form of electricity generation in history. And so we can actually learn a lot of lessons from that industry. And Greg Nemeth, who we've interviewed on OpenAir webinars before, has been a big influence. He's an innovation scholar at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, wrote a great book called How Solar Energy Became Cheap. And if you look at the experience of solar, there's some, again, real lessons I think that we need to take on board for DAC. One is that there were really important niches early on that were important customers for solar. You had the space program was the single buyer for solar for almost a decade, and it solved the problem. Yeah, you could use solar out in space. It solved the problem that other energy sources couldn't. You had the illegal marijuana industry. Off-grid growers needed a quiet, reliable source of energy. They were early users. Toys, calculators, consumer goods. And that created enough diversification and niches to help scale up the technology to bring down the price, where with some policy help, you could get into those prime market territories, namely rooftop solar, primarily in residential, but also commercial and industrial. And that's where solar really took took off and got us into a position where we could even do large utility scale solar today. And the key thing to take away from that too is when the price of solar really started to plummeting after a combination of global policies and that scale up, that price decline happening over the last decade or so, that was really done on the backs of rooftops. Really, again, it wasn't until about 2016 that you had most of the modules, or the majority of modules that were produced, were for utility scale. So it just shows you how distributed modular applications can aggregate in such a way to really make a huge impact. And so we're interested in that in the DAC space right now. Where can we find those distributed modular use cases that can help get that scale up? Some that you'll read about and you'll hear about quite a bit are indoor agriculture and greenhouses. This is using direct air capture on site to suffuse or enrich an indoor environment with carbon, which then increases yield speeds. And then you also, certainly in the beverage and food and beverage, and also in the beer brewing space, there's a real need for carbon dioxide, and they usually pay a very high price for that because it's food grade. So that's a really important potential niche. But what Lucia, Naeem, and myself over the last several months have been delving deeper into some of the maybe less talked about potential niches. This interconnects with fuel potentially, but you can use DAC to convert, take energy and chemically convert it into fuel as a way of sort of curbing the duck curve or the peak problem of certain intermittent renewable energy sources like solar. Indoor air quality, there's some interesting companies that are capitalizing on the fact that removing carbon dioxide excess from indoor office spaces increases cognitive function. And data centers, which will be the topic of the future, This Is CDR, are just all of a sudden, we're really excited about ways in which DAC could potentially be integrated with data centers to solve problems and remove carbon from the air. But of all of the niches that we've explored, concrete, I think, is the most exciting and the most ready. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Before I do that, though, just one kind of a couple of notes on something that we've already alluded to, but the linkages between early growth niches and distributed and modular forms of technology. So we're really interested in large projects to the extent that they can scale immediately. But we think a big part of this decade is going to require more distributed, spread out modular forms of direct air capture that can get out into the world quicker. So by distributed, we're just talking about decentralized installations in many different places that are usually located at the point where the output of that technology is utilized. Modular means technologies that can be subdivided or are subdivided into smaller interchangeable parts. And importantly, they can be sized per the need of the application. And so we think that these two aspects or characteristics are really key to niche penetration. The more that they exhibit these characteristics, the more options that we have to tailor DAC to different use cases. And again, solar is the sort of poster child of sort of modular climate tech and distributed climate tech. And so if you look at the value that solar has been able to generate, part of that has to do that it was valuable at any scale. It was again, from the calculator to the utility plant. However you divided it up, it could actually do something that would generate value and revenue. Relatively simple technologies are great because they create less barriers for implementation. They spark innovation and creativity among entrepreneurs. The more complex something becomes, the more prohibitive it is to actually use it. And then the last part I want to talk about, which is key with all of the niches that we're exploring, but central to the concrete one, is value and co-location itself, of bringing DAC to a use case. That itself, of closing the space between the two, is highly valuable, as we'll illustrate in a second. So again, we're looking at where is it that the modular and distributed forms of DAC, what's really interesting over the last year and change, where we've seen literally dozens of direct air capture companies making an announcement or go public, there's a lot of them that are clearly modular in design that do intend to be more distributed, at least at an early stage, which is exciting. And so we're wondering, like with solar, over this, again, critical decade, in the early years, will it be the distributed DAC that's going to bring the price down and then enable, as we get towards the end of this decade, more large-scale projects. And one really key thing to point out too is that, as we were talking about learning rates before, that's the price reduction per doubling of production. There's a strong association empirically between smaller, modular, and distributed technologies and high learning rates, and conversely, low learning rates in really large technologies. So this is just an example from a great paper by McQueen et al. Last year. You can see lithium batteries, solar PV, LEDs, really high learning rates because they're modular and distributed. And then you go down and you see, large hydroelectric power, very low learning rates. I believe one analysis showed that nuclear generation has a negative learning rate. So another reason why we want to be interested in modular, because we're interested in cost reduction. So now to talk about the concrete part and why we think it's such an interesting niche for DAC, just to first give you a bit of a snapshot of concrete as a material. One thing is it's an indispensable material. It's not going anywhere, particularly with any meaningful time frame for climate action. So it's a secure market. It's the second most used material on Earth after water, upwards of 35 billion tons a year with very high growth rates, particularly in emerging economies. And it just has performance, supply and use characteristics and cost characteristics that make it irreplaceable. If you were to immediately withdraw supply of concrete from right now, you'd be taking out the foundation of the built environment, essentially. Now, from a climate perspective, why concrete has a climate problem or a carbon problem has to do with one key ingredient, which is Portland cement. That's the binding ingredient that really, when you add water to it and the other parts, it makes concrete to be able to harden and be very, very strong and durable. And so it's only about 10 to 15% of the mass of concrete typically, but it's about 85% of the emissions. And because it's used so widely, it's a leading source of industrial emissions. It's about 7 to 8% of all global emissions, actually. If it was its own country, it would be the third largest emitter. So it's a very large source of emissions, and one that we're also sort of stuck with, or it's a little bit difficult to abate compared to some of the other major sources. Now, one of the other things that concrete, hydraulic cement-based concrete also has is it naturally mineralizes CO2 over time. So some of the concrete that's released in the production of cement and in the use of concrete is actually reabsorbed back into the concrete over time, substantial amounts, actually huge amounts of it, but it takes a really, really long time for that to happen. Now, what's exciting is there's a range of new technologies and companies, many of them, or a growing number of them on the market already, that look to sort of capitalize on that or augment that process by mineralizing carbon in the concrete on the front end. So putting carbon in the concrete, both for the sake of environmental friendliness, but the result is it leads to a better product, a more durable, stronger product that requires less resources like cement and water. So this is just a few of them that you may have heard of. There are others as well. And again, this area, when we hear about the carbon tech industry, that term that gets used a lot, that involves many, many different sectors, but it's fair to say that this, at the sort of the vanguard of this future, $2 trillion industry, it's really this carbon utilization in concrete, I think, is the most mature and the most already out there in the world. So now for the final part here is just what are the drivers that might bring direct air capture to carbon mineralization technology in use in the real world? What problems might they solve for each other? So I'm just going to go over those and then we'll stop for discussion. One, to state the obvious, CO2 mineralized concrete needs CO2. So it needs a supply of carbon dioxide. And in order to have optimal environmental and climate characteristics, a certain segment of CO2 must be procured, either from post-industrial sources. So you're taking carbon that may have already otherwise gone up into the air, and instead you're sequestering it in the material, or from other bio sources that are also low carbon, which is one segment of the available CO2 supply. And the other thing is that for reasons that I said just a few moments ago, there's huge upside to CO2 mineralized concrete in all of its different forms. It's not only is it attaching itself to a 35 billion ton a year industry that's only growing. Most of these technologies that I showed before, they're business to business firms that sell their technology to existing concrete producers. So they're not competing with a new disruptive form of technology that's going to shut down existing concrete plants. Instead, those are their customers. They're selling to them. So they're able to attach to something that's already large and growing. Now, this is probably the most important one when you really look at the details, is that direct air capture, modular site integrated direct air capture that's co-located can mitigate some of the real barriers or problems that a concrete company might face or might fear if they wanted to adopt carbon mineralization technologies, particularly that relate to uncertainty of supply and of volatility in the cost of CO2. So just to break that down a little bit, concrete is one of the oldest, it's probably the oldest construction industry on the planet. And it's a tough business. It's a commodity industry with razor thin margins, very schedule dependent. And these types of things kind of instill a conservatism in that industry of just kind of sticking to what we know. So if you already have that as part of the culture, any kind of newfangled thing can be a bit prohibitive. And with CO2 mineralization, you're talking about a new technology and a new segment that you're trying to introduce to the client, but also that you're trying to introduce to providers of carbon. There's many different industries, beverages and different industrial sectors that buy carbon at large amounts. So as a small industry using, in some cases, relatively small amounts of CO2, that doesn't put it in the best of positions to necessarily command the best terms for contracts or the best prices. The other thing too is that what we're seeing just in the last year or two is even more volatility in the merchant carbon market, where you have in certain areas sources of post-industrial sources shutting down. You have prices going up and going down, certain regions, dramatic cost increases. So this is a difficult profile for a new input for a concrete customer if they see that they can't necessarily depend on a consistent and low cost supply of carbon dioxide. So DAC in that case could come in and offer predictability, similar to the way solar could do that on a roof. You could have your DAC machine all under one roof, supplying carbon on a consistent basis. And particularly with certain business models, which we're seeing with some of the newer DAC startups, where they own the asset and then they offer CO2 as a service, that means that the capital cost for the concrete provider would actually be really, really low. So they get certainty and low cost and potentially the ability to have long-term fixed contracts. And the other fourth part has to do with the sort of operational capability or the sort of technical compatibility between DAC and concrete facilities. Just to look at the different forms of concrete, like block production or concrete masonry units, which you're seeing here, the ubiquitous concrete block. There's some interesting alignment there, just technically. These typically have kilns inside of them where there's waste heat that can be captured. Those kilns operate from between around 75 Celsius to 109 degrees Celsius, which is well within the range of many of the commercialized DAC thermal swing companies. So you could potentially utilize that rather than needing to generate your own heat. And if you just take one example of a company that is now well known, it's an X Prize winning carbon mineralization company that operates in the precast paver and block space, Carbon Built. This is a good fit for them. We're looking at a plants that their technology requires about 3 to 5 tons of CO2 per day per production line. So that's about 1,000 tons per year. And if you just look at, again, I just to at a high level present this, if you just take a look at Orca, 4,000 tons per year, basically 4 arrays with 2 units stacked on top of each other, each 1,000 tons, that's a really, really good fit. And what I did just to be clever here is I actually looked at a block producer in Reykjavik, not too far away from the Orca plant, and looked at the space that was available there. And this red square is the same size as an Orca unit. It's a 40 foot long container size. So it's a relatively small size that you would need in order to actually put DAC on site. And then the other thing, just looking at that particular company, which is emblematic, I think, of what you're seeing in the concrete space more globally, is a consciousness of the climate impact and trying to distinguish yourself in the marketplace by being more climate effective. And this is the note for that company in Reykjavik, which I won't attempt to pronounce. So you might have a willing customer just on the environmental edge that this type of utilization could give them. And then looking over to the ready mix side, which is 80% of global concrete is in the ready mix or the poured concrete. Now, these are cold plants. These don't have heat on site. But what's interesting is if you take an example of the other, I guess, arguably most well-known carbon mineralization company that already has hundreds of plants deployed around the world that does deploy at ready mix plants, CarbonCure, also an X Prize winner, they use carbon very, very efficiently to displace cement and water. And that's where they have their big bang for the buck for their climate impact is by using relatively small amounts of carbon to displace cement. That's great news from a DAC perspective, because if you, let's say, take 100 tons per year for a CarbonCure plant, that's a small footprint for a DAC facility at that plant. And that's really meaningful, particularly when you look at where concrete mostly is focused and where it's growing most in urban areas where there might be more space constraints. So here you can conceivably look at a DAC plant that really could be integrated at an existing facility, which is really exciting. And then the last point to make on this is that, short of injecting carbon into basalt, in fact, not even in short of it, maybe ahead of it, you could look at carbon being injected into concrete as a very, very high quality carbon removal that could command a very, very high price in the carbon credit, carbon market world. It's additional, it's absolutely permanent, and it's incredibly verifiable. You could essentially meter the carbon that's being drawn down with the DAC and meter what's going into the concrete. The visibility that you have on that is superior really to any other form of carbon removal. And that should fetch a high price that can be part of the revenue stream for that company or for the carbon mineralization company. And the other thing that's really interesting from a life cycle analysis perspective is it's highly localized. The block plant in New York that we deal with a lot, Glenwood Mason, a great company based in Brooklyn, all of their blocks are used in the city of New York. These are big, heavy units. So there's a real localized use. And that applies, for concrete in general, including ready mix, which has to be close to sites. And just to end with this, how do we quantify the impact opportunity? This is what I think is really exciting, and why, in addition to everything I just laid out, why we should really be exploring this as an opportunity. If you remember this slide from Lochner and Azarabadi, if you're looking at a 1,000-fold increase to get the price down to $100 a ton of CO2, and that's looking like 300 plants with 1,000 tons of carbon removal capacity per year, line that up against what we know about the size, just take the United States, about how many ready mix plants there are and how many block producers are. I was able to get the statistics from the respective industry groups. Just in the United States alone, there's almost 7,000 ready mix plants and about 250 block producers. If you take as your reference CarbonCure for the ready mix and Carbon Built for the block producers, 100 tons and 1,000 tons respectively, the totals that you get there from a possible carbon utilization rate just in the United States at full penetration is well over what we would need to get down to 100 tons. So it's a very compelling offer just in terms of the scale and scope of potential utilization here that could play a really meaningful impact in driving the price down and getting DAC out into the real world. And to make this happen, there's a couple of different things, like what can we look at in 2022 and beyond to start getting these applications or integrations to actually be happening in the real world? Policy, as I said, the definition of a niche for us is that you don't necessarily require a lot of policies, but there certainly are policies now that can be that can start to nudge this in the right direction. And this is just the portfolio of policies that OpenAir is working on right now, all three of which could have implications for this. LECCLA, the bill that Sue is about to get passed in New Jersey with her coalition, has an actual, it favors or adds a special bonus for carbon utilization in concrete. So that's helping create a market for that type. The CRLA, our Carbon Removal Leadership Act procurement bill, as well as the Luxembourg negative emissions tariff, another policy we're working on in Europe, are both essentially procurement or bonus, CDR bonus policies, where you could easily see a coalition of concrete producers combined with DAC bidding in and getting paid for by the state or by the country for that utilization. It would score very well in a procurement because it checks all the boxes. And that's to say nothing of what private sector pioneers like Stripe, Microsoft, and Shopify are doing also in this space. And then the last thing that is very open air, and I'll just leave this if folks are interested in joining, Naeem and myself and Lucia and other members of our communities, we're interested in activist business development. How can activists and advocates really try to make these types of projects happen, particularly first ones, which are so significant, just to show the world that it can happen. So we're planning really interesting things for 2022 that involve activist business development, crowdsourcing, where we're focused on in 2022, trying to sign up or get the very first integration of DAC plus concrete production done. So if anybody's interested in joining that effort, Megha or Sue will drop the link to the OpenAir join there. Come on and join us and be part of that conversation and part of that effort. And so with that, I will be quiet. Hopefully that wasn't too long. And I'll invite Naeem to come up and we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was great. I have some pre-selected questions, but given the time and that we're getting a lot of good questions in the Q&A, I'm just going to ask you guys one question, which has actually got three parts. So which DAC companies, you mentioned this a little bit with Climeworks, Chris, which DAC companies have small modular units that would be appropriate for concrete plants? And have any of them been targeting concrete plants? Have any concrete companies been investigating DAC? Kind of just wondering what's the state of affairs right now.
Well, since I just talked my throat off there for longer than I expected, I'll let Naeem go ahead and weigh in there because I know he's looking at it too.
Great, and thanks so much, Chris, for that excellent rundown. That was a good presentation. Yeah, I think there's a number of companies that are looking at this, and I think any direct air capture company that is kind of designing their technology to be modular in design and form, I think is a good fit for this. So I think of direct air capture companies like Heirloom Carbon or Mission Zero or even Climeworks. Anyone that's kind of designing their modules to be to kind of fill the need that a typical concrete plant would kind of require for CO2 inputs. I know that there are companies without kind of just over kind of sharing information that maybe I'm not supposed to share, but there are definitely direct air capture companies that are pursuing concrete plants and some of these partnerships in order to that see concrete as a viable kind of storage medium or permanent storage medium for CO2. So that's really exciting. Especially when you think about just the lack of existing kind of geologic sequestration infrastructure that is ready to be used right now, that concrete is actually a really great place to start for a lot of direct air capture companies. So that's absolutely happening. I think there might be a little less awareness from kind of concrete producers themselves around direct air capture companies that could be a good fit. But that's certainly, I think, what Chris said earlier about activist business development is like, I think that's a bridge we want to kind of try to cross between concrete producers and direct air capture companies and make this a lot more widespread of a practice.
Okay, great. Thanks, Naeem. Chris, did you have anything to add to that, or has he got it covered?
He's got it covered.
All right, great. Well, so now I know Megha's been really busy handling all the Q&A and posting links. Are you ready to post some audience questions, Megha?
Yeah, sure. I'll get into them, and there are a lot, but I'll try to go quickly and get some of the big ones. So one of the questions
Megha, one quick thing. I can, after the normal time, I can hang out here a little bit later too. If people want to keep chatting or something like that, I can answer some additional questions if we don't get to them.
Cool, sounds good. I'll just go through a few right now. So one of the first questions we got was that, are there any issues with the specs of the concrete? So in terms of what building codes might specify relative to what this kind of concrete does. And in particular, this person mentioned that some building codes specify aggregate content and other things, even if the functional performance might actually be compliant.
Yeah, so that's a bit more of an issue. You know, the carbon that goes in can come from wherever, so that won't affect the DAC piece. That's really more about whether or not local codes will approve utilization of some of these carbon mineralized concrete. And that's a really big thing. We're trying to, in our other efforts that Sue knows well about, try to shift the state thinking towards more open performance-based specifications that more select for strength, durability, things like that, rather than specific ingredients. And we're seeing some really good progress with that for different states. But I've been impressed by how some of these carbon mineralization companies, where they go, they've been very effective at demonstrating the value of their product and getting on those lists. I mean, I think Carbon Cure is really, really got this whole space going, and they're active all over the world now. So you can talk to them, but clearly they seem to not be confronting that issue.
Okay, cool. We had a couple of questions about just different end uses for these things. So someone said, sounds like your perspective is that we should accelerate deployment with less of a focus on cost and profitability, trusting that the cost will come down as deployment scales. And they're wondering if the niche markets for DAC CO2 could include other things like high value chemicals or other things where the end users are willing to pay a premium for that.
Nan, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, no, I absolutely see that there's some really interesting potential there, and what we're learning is that the the volumes that we would need in order to start really bringing DAC down the cost curve are not maybe as large as we initially thought. And I think especially if we kind of approach this with the kind of modular mass manufactured type of DAC units, and I think that then opens up the possibility that some of these kind of higher cost chemicals or certain kind of materials that we could use CO2 as input could be really exciting. So I certainly see that as a possibility and something that we should focus on, that has a higher kind of input cost of CO2. I think the important thing that needs to be considered is what are the kind of post-processing requirements for that particular end use product. Do we need a lot of energy? Do we need a lot of additional materials, additional processing after the capture of CO2 to make that viable? So even if there is a higher kind of value to that CO2 in the end product, the process of getting that CO2 into that product might be much harder. And so we need to think about that too.
Just to add one thing there about, I don't think we're sacrificing profitability when we're looking at niches. In fact, I think that might be the only places where you can find profitability. Some of the reason why they're valuable in these niches is that those are niches that have to buy carbon dioxide already at very expensive prices. So I think profitability can actually be had at those niches.
Makes sense. Someone asked why we're focusing so much on DAC as opposed to other sources of carbon. So this person mentioned, carbon capture from a cement factory or other sources. What's the reason for focusing so much on DAC here?
I'll just say one thing on that is that we're DAC people. We think DAC has to scale up, and we're looking for ways that DAC can get out into the world. So DAC, the carbon dioxide from a CCS or a DAC might be the same from a utilization perspective, but we're looking for ways where DAC can add particular value, where a buyer would want DAC CO2 instead of the other. And hopefully we laid out the case for that in this presentation. But go ahead, Naeem.
And I'll just add one thing as well to that. And I think the folks on this call and who are interested in this more generally, we need to shift our mindset a little bit more from we're just going to negate our carbon footprint or do something about our immediate carbon footprint. The job we need to do around carbon removal is huge, and DAC is going to play a really important role. And so we see concrete as being a great medium to help really serve as a launch pad for direct air capture. And so we kind of need, so yes, there's absolutely certainly non-DAC use, CO2 as an input for concrete makes a ton of sense. But we see concrete playing an extremely pivotal role in the long-term benefit that DAC is going to provide in addressing climate change beyond just the the negation of carbon in the atmosphere today, or reducing emissions from an ethanol plant today. It's the long-term potential that concrete has in addressing climate change through this partnership and integration of direct air capture.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Kind of on the same note, and maybe part of your answer addressed this, but someone asked about CO2 from biochar in particular, and whether that might be a cheaper way to kind of get this type of concrete started. What do you think about that, and also of the use of biochar actually in concrete itself?
I have been looking a little bit. I think that's extremely cool. I am constantly impressed by how creative and adaptable biochar is turning out to be. That can be used in all sorts of different things. So certainly all for that. And I don't think it's mutually exclusive of what we talked about here. I can't remember how biochar is being proposed as a use, if it's as an SCM, I think. So you, like a substitute for cement. So you could use both. You could stack, which would give you even better results. So I don't know a lot about it. So, but that seems reasonable to me.
Cool. We got a question. I think it was somewhere in the presentation. So they said the written notes said that waste heat was available in the concrete manufacturing process. Is it concrete manufacturing, or is it actually the cement manufacturing process where that's?
Cement has a ton of heat. It's one of the reasons why it's so emissions intensive. And then certain forms of concrete production, like precast and block, do have kilns, as I mentioned in the presentation, where you do have some heat in cold temperature climates for ready mix, just to keep it, so it doesn't freeze. But it's typically not the type of waste heat you need to drive a thermal swing DAC.
Got it. I'll just do a couple more before we close. One person asked, do you have some metrics in terms of how much CO2 in terms of like kilograms is captured per amount of volume of concrete for either road or standard spec concrete?
I don't have those offhand. Those are questions we do have. I'm very happy to see Rob Nevin and from Carbon Cure, and a lot of the other leaders from carbon upcycling technologies. I'll leave it to the crowd to answer that question, because they'll have exact numbers for you on that.
Cool. Yeah. Maybe they can put it in the chat, or just put that there so other people can also have a look at that. Okay, great. I'm just going to ask one last question before we close out, and then I'll hand back to Sue to just wrap up. I know you've mentioned this throughout at various points, but what do you think are kind of the top couple of policy things that need to happen to really accelerate this, and sort of in the way that will also help both DAC itself and DAC in concrete scale up?
I'll say a couple. I mean, I mentioned the procurement part there, which is one that, we are very focused on across the board, as our folks at Carbon Cure and the other carbon mineralization companies. They understand that's important, because the public sector buys about 40% of all the concrete that's actually produced. So they can have a huge influence over the trajectory of markets for this. So I would say public procurement, huge. Rob also put correctly those details around what's approved for specifications and codes. They make people's eyes glaze over, but they're so important. You have to have progress done there, raise awareness among structural engineers of products. I do think that I am interested in Naeem, you follow the constant changes or proposed changes to 45Q closer than I do, but I always thought one of the problems with 45Q is that it had a cap at the size. I think almost like the solar investment tax credit, there should be no minimum size project. If you could have a tax credit that could apply to this, that would make a huge difference too, I think.
Yes. That's absolutely right. Just some of these kind of minimum caps just don't make sense, and you wonder how any kind of direct air capture project gets off the ground when they're so high. But I think that's a really kind of important one, and I think it'd be interesting to see where where 45Q could go to make kind of DAC units that are kind of integrated with concrete plants or other kind of plants for kind of permanent storage and utilization could make sense. Another thing that I'd also throw in there is where kind of investment tax credits could make sense to just bring down the capital costs for concrete plants to bring on this new technology onto their on site. I think that would also go a long way. And another thing that I've started to see, governments don't know. I know the government of Canada was thinking about this at a certain point. I don't know how much progress they've made around this, but the idea that we can federally kind of procured concrete needs to be low carbon concrete, and however you get there, that's how you get there. But DAC will be then one of the ways that fulfills that need. So those sorts of kind of mandates from governments, you see these big infrastructure policies and plans going in place that could really benefit or really help low carbon concrete and DAC concrete integrations by requiring low carbon concrete in the concrete that's produced through that infrastructure procurement. So that's a big one that I guess federal governments could play.
Cool. Well, we're almost out of time. Sue, maybe you want to take over and just talk about the next couple of weeks of This Is CDR.
All right. So just a couple of announcements and upcoming events. As Chris mentioned, OpenAir has been working on CRLA, or the Carbon Removal Leadership Act. And that actually just got introduced into the New York Assembly by Assembly member Patricia Fahey, and which is great progress. And we're working on it in other states as well. So stay tuned. And then just to talk about some upcoming events, we have on January 6th, just a couple days from now, a webinar about the Luxembourg negative emissions tariff, which is a new CDR policy concept developed through OpenAir's collaborative collective intelligence relay process that will be introduced as legislation in the Luxembourg Chamber of Deputies in this year by Member of Parliament Sven Clement. So tune in for that. And then for this series, next week we have a CDR in the built environment presentation by Urban Sequoia, where they will talk about an architectural reimagining of the built environment as a carbon sink. And then after that, this is really exciting, we have on the 18th, just and equitable carbon removal, in which the high-profile environmental justice leader, Dr. Holly Jean Buck, will talk about how we can make just and equitable carbon removal policies, and her new book entitled Ending Fossil Fuels. And then the week after that, we have Moat, which is a startup that will be talking about carbon negative hydrogen made from wood waste. So that's what we've got going on. Thank you, everyone. And as Chris said, just hang out if you want to chat a little more, get some more questions answered. But thank you so much. This is being recorded. We'll send out the link to everybody. And thanks for your participation. Hope to see you next time.